So before I start bitching and moaning about a medium made by people way smarter than I am, it should be said that no cliche or mechanic is bad in a vacuum. Some mechanics that would be wonderful in some games would be disastrous in others, and would be foolish to brush off certain mechanics as inherently bad. With that being said, there are certain design choices that I would personally like to see less in the games that I play. It shouldn't be said, but obviously, this is a pretty subjective list and mostly my opinion. Anyway, let's move past the boring intro stuff. These are 5 video game mechanics I can't fucking stand. Walking segments. You know, those moments in gameplay where your character slows down and you're forced to either listen to some dialogue between some characters, or in worst cases, the developers just want to flex the look of their game. These fucking things became a norm in many third-person games during the 360 PS3 era, with characters in games now looking halfway decent without cutscenes. Now, I do understand the purpose of these parts. It's a way to tell the story without creating fancy cutscenes for everything. It balances out the pacing of a lot of games by letting players breathe between the action, and it's a way to hide loading screens and keep players immersed in the world. These are all great the first playthrough when you're first taking in the story and atmosphere. On subsequent playthroughs, man, this shit is a drag. You know how much of a buzzkill it is to be kicking ass in a game like God of War, only to be met with some long, slow walking segment where you know everything that's about to be said? I don't know about y'all, but when I replay a game, it's usually for pure gameplay. You know, the exciting parts that hook you in. These aren't those, and the worst part about it is that you can't even skip these. Too many cutscenes can be annoying too, but at least you can skip those bitches. I mean, is it that hard to implement or something? Would it be too much to ask for an option to skip these on New Game Plus modes? Linear climbing sections. You know, those parts in mostly third-person games where your character has to climb some clearly marked cliff or ledge to proceed through a level. You see these mostly in third-person action-adventure games such as Uncharted and Tomb Raider, where the character is usually an explorer, although a bunch of other games that aren't Indiana Jones clones have implemented them in the last decade. I get that it's just another way to get your character to a new location and also put some downtime between the action segments. My main problem is that there's usually no fucking challenge and it's way too automated. Oftentimes you're just leaning your character in the direction you're supposed to go. The way forward is so clearly marked that you don't really have to think about how you're supposed to navigate. And even if there's some pressure to go fast, like fire or ledges falling down, it's usually so perfectly tied to the normal climbing pace that it's barely even a worry. Honestly, just give me some regular platforming with pits and shit, because at least with that, you gotta time your jumps with the risk of dying. I won't go on about this any longer because every time I do, I feel like a crazy person since everyone else seems to be more or less fine with these. Time limits. I said it in the Jak 2 video and I stand by it. Does anyone actually like getting timed in their games? Like honestly, because for me, every time a game adds a big timer on screen, I'm now less immersed in the moment-to-moment gameplay and just using the cheapest tactics possible to get through that mission or level in a timely manner. It's always a binary too. Either a game barely gives you enough time to breathe, or they give you so much time that you can order and eat a meal while the game is unpaused. It should be fucking illegal for turn-based RPGs to have these. It's like, bruh, I'm already at the mercy of my character's animations. Clicking through menus as fast as possible only does so much. So far, I've only been talking about mission time limits though. What about those games where the whole damn experience is timed? Well, if I'm this annoyed getting timed on a micro scale, what makes you think that I would enjoy my entire game time counting down? I envy those kids that were able to get into games like Majora's Mask and Pikmin as a kid. For the former, as soon as the game told me that the world was going to end in 3 days, which is 54 real minutes by the way, I moved on to a different game real quick. This isn't to say that time limits don't work for those games. I'm sure that the unnerving atmosphere that Majora's Mask was trying to achieve wouldn't have worked as well if the apocalypse wasn't around the corner. I just prefer to go through games at my own pace and get challenged in other ways. Bullet sponge enemies. My god, there is nothing that turns me off of a shooting game more than this. You know, when an enemy or enemies take an absurd amount of shots to take down. It's the main reason I can never fully get into games like Destiny or The Division. Pumping lead into an enemy for 5 minutes straight just isn't fun, at least not for me. I find that shooting games usually feel a lot better when you're quickly popping off guys. The action's more visceral, there's more of an adrenaline rush, nothing gets my rock softer than when an enemy is shrugging off constant headshots. This is also one of the main reasons why I've never really cared for boss battles in shooting games, because 9 times out of 10, the challenge is just emptying your whole load onto the enemy. Actually, now that I think about it, I don't really like enemies with long ass health bars in any game genre, but with shooting games, it usually feels the worst since the damage you can deal is mostly just shooting. Now, this isn't to say that you can't have buff enemies in shooting games. I would just prefer the challenge of these enemies not to be their long ass health bars. Enemies that take forever to take down are boring and grindy, which brings me to my last point. Grinding, aka those long stretches of gameplay where you're doing incredibly repetitive tasks for loot, new skills, cosmetics, or what have you. Now this sounds kind of general, right? Every game has a repetitive loop to it to some extent. Gotta give players some shit to do between the standout moments, right? What I'm talking about are those grinds in games where what you're doing is so monotonous, it feels like the developers are padding out the game time. There's a lot of RPGs I quit because of shit like this, mostly JRPGs and MMOs, killing the same enemies in random encounters over and over again because your level dictates everything, those dumbass fetch quests or kill a certain amount of X enemy missions. Now, this is probably the most subjective point on this list, since when a game feels like a grind depends on the person. For me, it's when there's a lack of challenge and no noticeable signs of progression for a stretch. A lot of it also comes down to game feel. Of course, a game with kick-ass combat, full of spectacle and depth, will feel less grindy than a game with dull, shallow combat. I also feel like this is one of the reasons why a lot of people don't like turn-based combat, since it's usually paired with some awful grinding. I feel these people, but no grind is more painful than the one that's been pervasive amongst online games in the last decade. You know, where the game is designed from the ground up to take forever to earn anything unless you pay money. NBA 2K, where you have to play every single game in a season just to be as good as a bench player. GTA Online, where you have to play the same boring missions over and over again to get a card that isn't dog shit. Everything about every mobile game. Even games like Warframe and Monster Hunter, where you don't have to pay anything to get ahead. I still find the time sink of simply gathering resources to be too much for me, man. But hey, if y'all like this stuff, you can grind away in these games for me. Anyway, that's all I gotta say about this. Help this video out in the algorithm by doing the usual stuff, and until next time.